What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Rewired Soul podcast. And I am so excited for today's conversation. I am talking with Brian Earp about his book that he co-authored called Love Drugs, and it's such a phenomenal book. So who is Brian? Brian is one smart dude, all right? And he's so passionate about his research and his work. But yeah, he's a bioethicist, a philosopher, and an interdisciplinary researcher. And he is affiliated with both like Yale and Oxford and all sorts of stuff. Like, he knows his stuff, and this book is incredible. So something that, I know a lot of us can relate to, no matter who you are, the great equalizer is love and relationships and all of that. And just, a little quick backstory about your buddy Chris, for those of you who are new and, you haven't been around for a while and all that. But yeah, I struggled with relationships for most of my life, right? And, I've seen how relationships affect people. They can make you or they break you, right? Like, think about some of, your biggest bouts of depression and things like that. A lot of them come from breakups and relationships. I remember, breaking up with my high school sweetheart and all that. But anyways, Brian's book, Love Drugs, it's not just about love and relationships, but it's opening up the conversation about, some of the research that's going on when it comes to using medicine or even drugs like mushrooms or MDMA when it comes to love and relationships. So in this conversation, we talk about the book and some of the different research that's being done when it comes to people who struggle with PTSD from because they're an assault victim, and how do they cope with the relationships, and can different drugs or medications help. We also talk about, people with depression and some of the side effects of these SSRIs and things like that. So it's a really, really excellent book. And I had a great time asking Brian these questions and hearing what he had to say and all that. So yeah, it was great. But anyways, before I get started, just real quick, for those of you who are new, if you haven't yet, if you're listening on Apple, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you like it at the end, rate it, review it, let me know what you think. But anyways, since this is a newer podcast, this really helps like the podcast algorithms on Apple, or if you follow it on Spotify, it helps tell, Apple or Spotify, hey, I like this, other people might like this, and it helps distribute it out there. But another way you can help support the podcast is just share the episode on social media. Like, I know for a fact that you got a friend who's in a terrible relationship, and they might need to hear this conversation that I'm having with Brian. So share this episode over on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever social media platform tickles your fancy, all right? But anyways, without further ado, here is my conversation with Brian Earp talking about his book, Love Drugs. Hey, Brian, hope you're doing well today. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast to discuss the book, Love Drugs. So let's kick this thing off. I want to talk about early on in the book, and one of the earlier chapters, I think it was, you discuss monogamy and the evolutionary psychology behind pair bonds, right? And it sounds like it's advantageous for humans to be committed in their relationships with just one person. But something that I've noticed, and maybe it's just because I'm, from Las Vegas, who knows, but I've noticed that there's like this growing popularity with polyamory. So when I see, like my friends or, whoever it is getting in polyamorous relationships, it doesn't seem like they often work out. Like we're just not wired for it. So my question for you, do you think poly relationships can work, and why or why not? And do you have any advice for people who want to try a polyamorous relationship or are currently in one, to help them, fight the evolutionary psychology behind why these things typically don't work?
I guess what I would say here is that there's really a range of dispositions that humans have with respect to monogamy versus polyamory. There's a trait called sociosexuality, which can be measured, and people who score high on this trait tend to be open to multiple partners. They tend to think positively about the idea of having sexual and emotional relationships with more than one person at a time. And those who score low on this trait seem to be perfectly happy in monogamous relationships, and they're content with one partner with whom they might parent in the case of people who want children, and they'll kind of put their eggs in one basket. And so I wouldn't say that there's one underlying human nature. In fact, I think the chapter you might be referring to is called Human Natures, with an S on the end, precisely to point out that when we're thinking about these things, we shouldn't be satisfied with a one-size-fits-all model. In your question is embedded this idea that basically, we're wired up to be monogamous, but I think that people could equally say that there's some problems and limitations with that view. I mean, one of the leading causes of divorce today is affairs, basically extramarital sex. And so if all of us were happy being in sexually exclusive relationships with one person year after year, then you wouldn't find this kind of behavior being as common as it is. So in the book, basically, we're just trying to acknowledge that when we're thinking about what should our relationship values be, if we're thinking about intervening in our relationships with biotechnology or in any other way, we have to have some sense of what's the goal, what's the normative framework within which we're having this conversation. And we didn't want to be prescriptive and say, a successful relationship is a sexually exclusive monogamous relationship that lasts until one or both partners dies. We wanted to say that's one model of a successful relationship that certainly will work for a lot of people. And there are some people who are, as it were, naturally disposed to favor that kind of relationship. But we shouldn't forget that human sexual and relational dispositions fall on a spectrum like so many other traits. And there are some people for whom the most natural arrangement for them in terms of their deep-seated feelings and what would make them happiest in the long run if they were socially supported would be, a polyamorous arrangement. And, there's not as many role models in society or storylines that you can follow to sort of see how does that work out, what are the rules. But there's growing interest, as you point out, and subcultures that are sort of practicing different ways of making that work. And so it takes practice to figure out how to successfully operate under that relationship model, just like it takes practice to figure out how to have successful monogamous relationships.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and that does make sense, and I could see how that kind of varies from person to person. You bring up an excellent point too about, if we were purely wired for monogamous relationships, why are there so many, divorces and, cheating and people, just leaving their significant other for someone else? And yeah, that's all really interesting to me, and something I've thought about, especially when I got sober and I was looking at, the fourth step in 12-step programs where they talk about, taking a personal inventory. And I realize it's kind of, subjectivity to all of it. And it depends on who the person is, right? It depends on what a specific person is looking for. If somebody doesn't want a commitment and they want to, be with multiple people or whatever, like, in my personal opinion, as long as they're being honest with whoever they're, with or seeing or sleeping with, like, hey, good for them. There's nothing, immoral about that. But yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point too, that we don't have enough models to really see what will make it successful. And who knows, like, I might have like a certain a certain narrow scope from people who I've seen experiment with these relationships. I'm sure there are plenty of successful ones. And yeah, just from my experience, it seems to me, this is just my theory. It seems that, jealousy and things like that, just they inevitably come into play, and one or both people wanted to try it, but their tendency for that wanting of a commitment and catching feelings and all that kind of stuff, it kind of interrupts the whole polyamorous idea. But that kind of leads me to my next question. There was something really interesting that you talked about in the book, and it was this relationship between obsessive compulsive disorder and jealousy. So there's a ton of people out there who recognize their jealous tendencies, but as you discuss, for some people, it's this kind of like uncontrollable urge to constantly be checking on their significant other or their spouse. And in some cases, they're, jealous of somebody that they're just kind of courting in the relationship. They're not even like officially dating. But anyways, if someone is prone to jealousy and or obsessive compulsive disorder, or just, behaviors, what are some steps they can take to begin working on their issues with jealousy?
One of the points that we raise in the book is that obsessive compulsive disorder and jealousy have some overlapping symptoms, including the one you mentioned, which is this tendency to check and recheck. So in the case of OCD, it might be that you keep checking whether you locked your car door, 10 different times before you're satisfied, and then you move on. And similarly, in the case of jealousy, you might check and recheck whether your partner was where they said they would be, when they said they'd be there, and who were they with. And you're not really satisfied until you've gone through this loop a number of times in your mind. And there's some neuroscientific work suggesting that at the level of the brain and neurochemistry, there's potentially some overlap between these things as well. So there's some evidence that the way that serotonin works in the brain, if you have depleted levels of serotonin, this can cause this kind of obsessive tendencies, both in the case of OCD and in the case of jealousy. And so from a drug-based perspective, it's been proposed that serotonin-enhancing drugs like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, which are also used to treat depression, but they're used in the case of OCD as well, ideally in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy. So if your jealousy is like a really serious problem for the relationship, to the point where it's threatening the ability of you and your partner to have a flourishing connection together, and you want to work on it, there's all sorts of things you can try to do kind of on your own. And one of them is to just be aware of the fact that you're behaving in an obsessive way, and that you're putting your relationship at risk. And you might want to think about what the underlying issues are with trust in the relationship, and try to deal with those directly. And if it really gets out of hand and you find that you've tried other things and it doesn't work, it might very well be the sort of thing you'd want to talk about with a therapist, and they'd probably work with you with cognitive behavioral therapy. And then, in the book, we discuss a case study of a psychiatrist who went further than that, and the jealousy was so extreme in the case of this particular man that the psychiatrist combined cognitive behavioral therapy with a serotonin-affecting drug, so as to try to address this problem with a 1-2 punch. And it seemed to be successful in this case study that we analyzed. But there's not a whole lot of research on treating jealousy with medication more systematically.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, now that we're, just finishing up the second question, I'd even write down some more questions that I'm just now thinking of in the middle of this interview. But everybody listening, go get love drugs. I've mentioned it. I'm going to mention it again at the end, but it's linked down in the description. But yeah, you discuss, these kind of, combinations between CBT and SSRIs or medications. But, as the title suggests, love drugs, like that was just, I don't know. I've spent years, studying mental health, and, I'm somebody who takes mental health medications. I'm on an SSRI and things like that. And your book was the first book that I came across that is really talking about, our relationships and how certain medications and things like that, may affect it. But yeah, it's really interesting, just from, my experience and experience of, people in my life who, have been in relationships, and, when jealousy comes up and everything. And, I see that it seems that we're kind of in this, I don't know, we get into this place where it's hard to address and become self-aware, and we're willing to admit, we're jealous, which then leads us to that next step of reaching out and getting help from, whether it's, just our doctor or psychiatrist, or, even going to therapy. That was the biggest thing that helped me with my relationships, was realizing, like, wait, like, I've been, dating, since I was a teenager, and I can't, it wouldn't make sense to blame everything on every girl I've ever dated. Like, at what point am I the problem? And, I had to swallow some pride and realize, like, I had to look at myself, and, sometimes it is mental health stuff. Like, while I don't personally suffer from OCD, through a lot of therapy and things like that, the working theory is that a lot of things, from my childhood and things like that have messed up, my trust issues and attachment issues. But anyways, we'll move past that. But anyway, if you're listening to this, get the book, go to therapy, check some stuff out. But Brian offers a ton of interesting research and studies in the book. But anyways, moving on to the next question. So like millions of other people around the world, as I mentioned, I've struggled with, mental health issues most of my life. I have a generalized anxiety disorder. I've struggled with depression. I'm currently on an SSRI, as I mentioned, and, medications have worked wonders for me. But something that you discuss a little bit in the book, and it's something that I've noticed, like, when I talk to people and I ask, guys, and, hey, have you tried medications? Unfortunately, a lot of these medications, they have these side effects that can include lowering your libido. And it seems like that's one of the main reasons, aside from just, not wanting to, open up and admit they have depression. But it seems like one of the main reasons that men in particular stay away from antidepressant medications. And yeah, you make some great points in the book about how sometimes a lowered libido is actually beneficial for some men. So, in your opinion, what are your thoughts on that trade-off between being depressed or having a low libido? And, based on your research and everything like that, are there any solutions for men who need antidepressants, but they're worried about these types of side effects?
So you're right that a low libido is a common side effect of SSRIs, these antidepressants we've been talking about, that work on the serotonin system. And in some studies, the estimates are as high as 20%. Other studies have a bit of a lower percentage, but in any case, it's a common, frequent side effect. And for people who have a strong desire to have a sexual aspect to their romantic relationship, which is very common. Maybe most people in a romantic relationship would like there to be a sexual component, unless perhaps one or both partners is asexual. And so it can be devastating for a relationship to lose the more visceral drive to want to be with your partner sexually. In the book, we try to just make the point that we shouldn't normalize or pathologize any particular level of libido across the board, because it depends on the values and the needs that are present for any given couple. So in some cases, one partner might have a very strong libido and the other partner might have a naturally lower libido. And in some couples, this mismatch can create quite a lot of tension. And so we propose this hypothetical case where a person might be taking a drug to treat depression or anxiety, let's say, and they might be taking a drug that isn't one of these SSRIs, but is a different type of drug. So we talk about, I think, NDRIs, which are norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake inhibitors. And these tend not to have the same kind of sexual side effects. So I think one of the trade names is bupropion, or Wellbutrin is the trade name. Bupropion is the name of this drug. And so suppose you're taking this drug to treat your depression and it's not lowering your libido, but you're in a situation where actually maybe you would like to have a lower libido. Let's suppose that your partner has tried to raise their libido by whatever means to try to meet your level, and all those methods haven't worked. Well, one possibility is, you ask your doctor, can I switch from this drug I'm taking to treat depression that doesn't have side effects, the NDRI, doesn't have sexual side effects, I should say, to an SSRI, which at least has a decent chance of lowering your libido. And suppose that you take this drug and it works, and you still have some libido, but it's lower than it was before, and maybe it's similar to your partner's, and in some way you're now synced up, and you can imagine anyway, hypothetically, how that could improve this particular relationship. So we're not suggesting that that's generally the case. And when you talk about trade-offs, between dealing with depression, taking a drug, whether that's something that's going to work for you or not, and, potential effects on your sex life, it's going to be a case-by-case analysis where you have to think, what really are the side effects for you of this particular drug? Have you tried non-drug mediated ways of dealing with problems, whether it's depression or problems in your relationship? And then how do you see those trade-offs play out for you and your partner? And, the broader theme of the book that we're just trying to raise is when we take drugs for depression or for other issues in psychiatry, we shouldn't just be thinking about how these drugs affect our symptoms of depression, let's say. We should be thinking about the effects of these drugs more generally on our social relationships, including our romantic partnerships. And a sort of obvious case here is that, SSRIs are known to have a pretty high chance of negatively affecting libido, or lowering libido, I should say. But they can also have effects on higher level processes, like the extent to which you might be inclined to care about your partner's feelings. And so that's something where there's a bunch of case studies suggesting that happens in some cases, but it's not systematically studied. And so we think if we're going to continue to prescribe these powerful drugs that can affect our sex drive, that can affect our emotional life, we have to be alert to the side effects on relationships, not just on individuals. And then when we do that, we have to then couch those side effects within a value structure that applies to a given relationship and decide whether having a higher or a lower libido is better or worse for that particular couple, if that's one of the likely effects of the drug. And so then you take all of that into account when making a decision about whether you want to take a drug to address depression, or whether in some cases it might not be worth it given the negative side effects for your relationship.
I love it. I love it. That was so well said. And yeah, based on my personal experience, dealing with my own mental health issues, working in a treatment center, and, talking with a lot of people who come to me and ask me about this, I don't have anywhere near the credentials that you do. But yeah, I let people know, like, it's case by case. It's based on our own experience. And for me personally, what's really helped in all aspects of, my mental health and just my life and everything like that is asking questions and doing research and following up, as somebody who, in my active addiction, I was terrible. I was terrible about being transparent with doctors and letting them know how I was doing, how I was feeling, how, on the follow-ups and all that kind of stuff. And now, like, it is one of the most important things where I'm open, I'm honest. I talk about, the pros and the cons, right? Especially when it comes to medications. But, and I'm no therapist, right? But, the relationship that, I'm currently in, I've been with my lovely girlfriend for, over 4 years now. And one reason I believe our relationship works is because we have this very open line of communication, right? Like I tell her about, my doctor just prescribed me, some Prozac, and, and, if I'm starting to act weird or different, let me know, because I might not recognize it, and things like that. And we're very open and honest and discuss our mental health, and that's really important to me, because I believe, like you're saying, it depends on the relationship. It depends on what's going on. And for me personally, something that's just been crucial is that open line of communication. I had to get past, the embarrassing conversations or awkward conversations or whatever, we're in this we're all in this together. You know what I mean? Well, not all of us, unless unless we go back to the polyamorous stuff. But anyways, moving on. I'm coming up on 9 years sober this month, June 23rd. Not to toot my own horn, but it's pretty sweet. But anyways, so the book, it's Love Drugs, right? And it talks a lot about drugs and, not only, like SSRIs and stuff like that we're talking about, but also psychedelics and things, right? And, people are often surprised, but even though I've been 100% abstinent from alcohol and drugs for, coming up on 9 years, I'm very pro legalization. And I've seen the research and the studies and how beneficial, like, psychedelics like psilocybin can be for all sorts of different mental health issues. But anyways, when I look at this stuff and I read about it and learn about it, I think back to my many relapses, and a lot of them started with a natural drug, right? Like pot, like marijuana. I would use that, and then it would just make me want to go get high off my drug of choice, which was prescription opioids. But yeah, again, like psychedelics, like we know that they could be very, very helpful. But, me personally, I don't, really think that I would ever try psychedelics, even though I'm 100% for the legalization. It's one of those things like, even though I can't take it, I see the benefits for other people. So based on your research, can you discuss some of the findings for how psychedelics can, improve relationships, just so, people can be a little bit better informed, and kind of like we just talked about, they can weigh, the pros and cons for themselves?
Sure. So, there was some research back in the 1970s and 1980s where couples counselors would use psychedelics like psilocybin from magic mushrooms, or they might use MDMA, which is the active ingredient in ecstasy. MDMA isn't really a psychedelic because it acts differently on the brain, but sometimes people think of these drugs all in one group. But in either case, whether it was MDMA-enhanced couples counseling or psilocybin-enhanced couples counseling, what some people were finding in these early therapeutic sessions, and mostly this is a series of case studies, you don't have too much systematic research back in the 1980s, but therapists would report on their experiences working with clients. And what they found is that, for a lot of people, there are certain things in their relationship that they know they want to work on, but they can't bring themselves to really talk about it productively with their partner. For example, they might be stuck in a loop there where there's, the same grudges are repeated year after year, or, you're just so used to your partner acting a certain way and you respond in a certain way, and you're caught in this unproductive cycle where you can't really hear your partner with fresh ears. You're almost just drowning them out with your defense mechanisms or whatever it might be. And if you're in this kind of situation, but you really, both of you feel that there's something in the relationship worth preserving, and you want to try to improve your connection, and you've tried talk therapy and it hasn't seemed to work for you, one possibility is that under the influence of these drugs in a therapeutic setting, first of all, some of those defense mechanisms might be temporarily disarmed, so that you find yourself responding in a more reflective way, where it's not so automatic stimulus response. You may be able to hear your partner in a new way and look at them with fresh eyes, and maybe remember how you felt when you first met them. So some people reported that they felt after these therapeutic sessions with MDMA that they felt like they were 16 again and just falling in love with their partner, partly because what some of these drugs can do, at least what the current theories are suggesting, is that they sort of wash out old habits and patterns that have become ossified in your mind. So they sort of depress some of your prior beliefs and concepts and allow you to take in information and categorize it less rigidly. And you can look at it from a new perspective and sort of decide now whether you want to create some new categories in your mind for how you think about your partner or think about the dynamics between you. In the case of MDMA, partly what it does also is it temporarily suppresses a hair trigger fear response, which can come up in the case of trauma. So right now they're doing these trials looking at MDMA-enhanced psychotherapy for people with post-traumatic stress disorder that haven't been able to treat their symptoms with other methods, although they've tried them and they haven't succeeded. And for people with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, what they're finding so far is pretty promising results where instead of shutting down when they're asked to talk about the trauma that they've been suppressing, they don't have that immediate fear response under the influence of this drug, and so they're able to kind of approach the trauma and work on it with a therapist, and that alone can have very positive effects for relationships in the sense that PTSD can be very damaging to relationships. And so if you find a successful treatment for it, then it's not going to be good just for you, but it might be good for your relationships as well. And very recently now they've done some preliminary trials with couples that are more rigorous than what was done in the 1980s, now that there's this sort of renaissance of looking at psychedelic medicine, where one of the partners has PTSD, but the other may not, and then both of them will undergo drug-assisted psychotherapy and work on various things in the relationship, including the PTSD. But a point that we raise in the book is that, you know, trauma falls on a spectrum. Not everybody meets all the clinical criteria for getting an official diagnosis, but sometimes relationships themselves can have aspects of trauma that have come up over the years. And so there's some reason to think that people with subclinical difficulties in their lives and relationships might also benefit from these kinds of drug-assisted psychotherapies. And so we propose that more systematic research go into that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something like the older I get, the more, you know, just it blows my mind, right? Throughout my life, I've known so many people who have PTSD from some sort of trauma, and a lot of it is, you know, sexual assault. And when I started working at a treatment center, you know, with people trying to, you know, overcome their you know, drug or alcohol addictions, like so many people have been assaulted and they struggle with PTSD. But, you know, not only is this a major issue, but the thing is that, you know, it can have these lasting effects that affect your relationships, right? Like for the rest of your life. And that's one of the reasons why I'm such a huge advocate for, you know, various types of therapy just to work on PTSD. But I love that, you know, you're discussing these things about, you know, what the research is showing about how people who struggle with PTSD and it might be affecting their relationship, like they're looking into this, they're researching it, you know, there might be solutions, and that's why I recommend people, you know, check out your book. It covers so many things, and yeah, like I've had friends, I've known people, I've had, you know, clients I worked with where their relationships were either struggling or they ended because of their traumatic experience. But one thing, I want to toss this in here. Aside from, you know, telling everybody how amazing your book is, I'm also linking Brian's Twitter down in the description below. Like, this guy, he shares so many studies on Twitter. So, like, if you're a nerd like me and you want to hear about the latest and greatest studies, like in all sorts of different categories, like not just, you know, studies on, like, you know, psychedelics and MDMA and things like that, but like he shares so many interesting studies, and I love it. I absolutely love it. So make sure you're following Brian over on Twitter. I have his link down below. But yeah, real quick, I wanted to piggyback off that last question. So for someone like you who's into all these studies and researches this stuff, what are your thoughts around the current state of America drug policies? Because it seems like more and more states are leaning towards legalizing marijuana. Like here in Nevada, where I'm from, we legalized it, you know, 4 years ago. There's like dispensaries now, and they get taxed, and some of that comes back to the, you know, the state, the city, and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, we saw in the recent 2020 elections, more and more states started either decriminalizing or legalizing and stuff like that. But anyways, From your point of view, where do you see, the United States in the next 10 years when it comes to drug policy, not just, legalization for recreational use, but like we're talking about for, medicinal purposes and treating, mental health disorders like depression or PTSD. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's basically a consensus among drug researchers that the prohibition of drugs, the war on drugs, is more harmful than the kinds of harms that it's supposed to be helping with by supposedly preventing people from taking drugs that are thought to have all these bad side effects. So although, drug researchers acknowledge that there are some drugs that can be misused or overused, and you don't want to necessarily have all drugs accessible to anyone at all times, prohibiting drugs and driving drug use underground and creating these illegal markets just exacerbates the harms, makes things on balance much worse than if the drugs weren't prohibited in this way and were instead either decriminalized or legally regulated in the way that we legally regulate alcohol. I mean, alcohol is far more dangerous than a lot of the currently prohibited drugs, certainly more dangerous than psilocybin and more dangerous than marijuana. And yet we know what happened with prohibition of alcohol. I mean, the mafia being created and so forth. And so we should have already learned that lesson, and we learned it to an extent with alcohol. But some of the other drugs that have been listed as these prohibited substances, I mean, there's a long history of very politically troubling reasons for doing this. Opium was associated with Chinese immigrants, and some initial banning of opium was motivated by explicitly racist desires to sort of stigmatize a drug that was popular with those groups. The association with Mexicans and marijuana is part of what's going on there. And then, you see Black Americans, especially younger men, being disproportionately arrested and incarcerated for using drugs at a similar rate to white people. And so in the way that the so-called war on drugs has been prosecuted has some really troubling racist implications as well. And so it's just a bad policy. And everybody knows it's a bad policy, at least anybody who's an expert in this area and has studied it. And that's been known for something like 40 years. What's interesting is that over the last 5 years or maybe 10 years is that you're starting to see a wider swath of the political spectrum and people in different positions of power who hold the levers for potentially making changes to policies are waking up to this fact. They're just realizing that the war on drugs is a totally failed policy. And the question now is, what should we do instead? And there's basically two main moves that people will make here. Some people say you should adopt what's called the Portugal model, which is where you decriminalize the personal use and possession of small quantities of so-called recreational drugs, all of the drugs that are currently prohibited, like psychedelic drugs, but also heroin and cocaine. And the idea here is that you ramp up funding for healthcare measures for people who are dealing with medical problems or addiction related to drug use, but you just take this out of the criminal field where you're not arresting people and putting them in jail simply for using drugs if they're not directly harming other people by, through assault or robbery or whatever it is. But you don't fully legalize these drugs. You don't make it so that, someone can go to a pharmacy and pick up, a dose of cocaine, let's say. And then on the other side of things, you have people who are proposing a fuller legal regulation where basically all so-called recreational drugs would be legally available under certain conditions for personal use. And so you're seeing something approaching this model in the state of Oregon, which just in the last year, I believe, passed an ordinance to make psychedelic drugs, at least, I believe, legally available in a sort of licensed setting where there would be a trained guide or therapist who would administer and oversee the use of the drug, but it wouldn't be just for medical purposes. It wouldn't be that you have to have some diagnosed thing that's being treated with the use of the drug, but rather it would be usable for, personal enhancement or personal development or exploration of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And the point is just that people are doing these things anyway, but the way that they're sourcing their drugs now is from illegal markets. And so the idea is prohibition doesn't make drug use go away, it just makes it more dangerous. And if you can find a way to make these drugs available under circumscribed settings, so that perhaps you have to demonstrate a certain amount of competence and knowledge in how to use the drug safely, for example, or you use it in a licensed setting like in the Oregon model, then the idea is that, mostly the same people who would be interested in using these drugs would continue to use them, but they would, be able to use them under safer conditions. There's some debate that maybe people who otherwise wouldn't be using drugs might use them if they became legally regulated in this way. And some people are concerned that this use could be harmful in some cases if people weren't using the drugs in a safe way. But so far the evidence from at least the Portugal situation is that with decriminalization, you don't see a huge spike of new use of drugs from people who otherwise wouldn't be using them. So, one way or another, whether it's through decriminalization with harm reduction measures and increased expenditure on healthcare for dealing with addiction and so forth, or a fully legally regulated model of drug use, the point is that it's just kind of crazy to be locking people up for simply using drugs if they're not harming others, if they're not violating other people's rights. And that insofar as there are harms to the misuse of drugs, these should be addressed through healthcare and social support services, not through criminalization, especially given that the way the criminal prosecution of these cases is done in a racially unjust way. And in the history of the war on drugs had racist implications from the start. So that's kind of where the conversation is now. I think in the next 10 years, there probably are going to be more states that adopt the Oregon model and make at least some currently prohibited drugs available for personal use. Sometimes people call these recreational drugs, and I think in a way that's misleading. So let's say a person is using psilocybin. They're out in the woods and they take some mushrooms with their friends. Some people might do something like that for recreation, i.e. for fun. But psychedelic drugs have been used in many cultures for spiritual development and for gaining real insights into how one's own mind works or how one relates to others or reevaluating one's own emotions and so forth. And so I think the label of recreational drugs implies that it's just for kicks, which, obviously many of these drugs are used that way, or for people going to parties and so forth. But drugs can be used for lots of different reasons, and they have been used historically and in many cultures still today for all sorts of reasons that might seem more like personal enhancement or something like that. And so we should be alert to those possibilities.
Brian is preaching right now. I love it. Like you said, this is something that I don't know how many people understand this, or if they're taking this knowledge into the voting booth. But the war on drugs was failed. So many of these policies were created with these kind of like racist ideologies and intentions to discriminate, and so many issues. And something that I'm very passionate about is educating people and destigmatizing addiction and helping to educate people like addiction is this sickness. And like you said, you start funding more services, right? Whether it's detox centers, treatment centers, even therapists and social workers and all these things, right? We rehabilitate people. But yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up too, about this kind of way that we talk about them as recreational use, when there's so many medicinal benefits, and people use it for spirituality and things like that. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not something that I'm personally going to do just because my history with substance abuse and how I, start with one and I go to something else. But for me, as, somebody sober and not planning on it, no matter how legal it gets, like, the longer method that I found is, through meditation and things like that. Right. But in my opinion, to everybody, to each their own. If you could do these and you're not going to go run out and, get hooked on opioids like, someone like me, then do your thing. But we do have this major issue, and yeah, based on, everything I've read and researched, there are great benefits to these kind of experience is being done under the guide of like, a trained mental health professional. Some people, go to other countries like, and use like ayahuasca or, other psychedelics, and it's with like a spiritual guide, but yeah, I really hope that the country moves in the right direction. I'm personally very optimistic about this. In the next 10 years, I'm thinking like we're slowly seeing this stuff change. So yeah, I want to ask you this one final question. One thing that I've noticed, and this is something that I just recently became educated on as well, but a lot of people, the conventional wisdom around oxytocin is that it's the most wondrous, amazing neurotransmitter that we have, right? Like you hear about oxytocin and it brings us together and we love each other and we just want to cuddle and all these other things, right? But, that's the typical story that we hear. But in your book, you discuss how there's also kind of this dark side to oxytocin, which I'm just now learning about. And, it could negatively affect people, right? It can encourage bad behavior, especially in groups. So can you explain just a little bit why this is, what can go wrong with oxytocin, and what are some ways that people, the audience, me, everybody can kind of monitor whether our oxytocin is promoting good or bad behaviors so we can make better decisions and be a little bit more self-aware?
So the dark side of oxytocin that some researchers have proposed is that when it's artificially administered through a nasal spray, and it sort of goes up past the blood-brain barrier and into the brain. There's some evidence from these controlled experiments with economic games that people can either favor their in-group more when they're under the influence of this intranasal oxytocin, or they may have a sort of out-group prejudice that's enhanced. Sometimes these two results are kind of conflated and people aren't sure which is really the finding. I have two concerns about these findings. The first is that a lot of the initial results from the oxytocin literature, where you spray the substance up the participant's nose or they get a placebo nasal spray, and then you have them engage in some sort of artificial task like a trust game or an economic game, often with an anonymous other person, where the effect of oxytocin is lasting for just as long as the experiment, and then they leave the lab and you don't actually know what the long-term effects are, is that a lot of these initial results don't seem to replicate. Basically what will happen is different laboratories will all run versions of the same experiment, and maybe they don't quite get the effect that they anticipated on the first study, so they say, well, let's call that a pilot study because maybe we need to tweak some aspect of the experimental design, and then they run it again, or a different lab is running it, and you'll find that a subset of these experiments seem to show some kind of effect, and those are the ones that get published. And so in recent years, a number of leading oxytocin researchers have said, let's actually look in our file drawer, let's look at all the failed experiments that we've run and include those in the meta-analyses and make sure that we really are looking at the full body of evidence. And what a lot of them are suggesting is that overall, it's not clear that there really is robust evidence for these kinds of effects, whether, increasing in-group favoritism or increasing out-group prejudice of some kind. And so, one, I'm not sure how robust these findings are. But another thing to think about is that we release oxytocin in our own brains all the time. For example, when we engage in sensual touch with our partner, or we hug someone, or we, look at a dog. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we can do where we stimulate the release of oxytocin within our own brains. And it might well be that when we're, having an orgasm with our partner and we're flooding our brains with oxytocin, it might be that, for the next 20 minutes or so, we have a sort of in-group favoritism or increased out-group prejudice even. But no one would suggest that we shouldn't engage in sexual activity because it will increase oxytocin endogenously and therefore might have these negative side effects. So, unless you could show that spraying oxytocin up people's noses has somehow more extreme effects than the natural release of oxytocin that happens all the time through our behavior with others, it would just be strange to think that somehow we should prohibit the use of that or be particularly worried about that. But then, as I say, a lot of the initial results that got people excited about the idea that oxytocin increases trust and bonding and eye contact and all that stuff, a lot of those initial results don't seem to replicate. And currently, the literature is kind of a shrug as to whether these results are going to hold up over time. So we need more evidence about whether oxytocin is as wondrous a molecule as some people have proposed.
Ah, yeah, the good old replication crisis. I actually had Stuart Ritchie as the first guest on the podcast, and yeah, that's when I first really realized it. I didn't realize this was an issue with these oxytocin studies, because I've heard about that with the oxytocin nasal spray and things like that, and like you could, I think, don't quote me on this, do your independent research, listeners, but yeah, I think you could like buy some of this nasal spray, but who knows, it might even be a placebo, but that's really interesting, because yeah, we don't if we don't know for sure, it's kind of like, ugh. But yeah, I think some of the research, I came across too, was talking about how, during like, not necessarily like riots, right? But, when there's, our in-group is against their group or whatever, oxytocin is flowing there too. So yeah, so for me, it's just kind of being more self-aware of, I like to learn about crowd psychology and things like that, and just try to, be mindful and aware of, just the whole idea of like tribalism and all that kind of stuff. Because to me, that is just one of, it could be one of the best parts of human nature, or just like one of the worst. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on the podcast so much. I love your book so much. But yeah, before I let you go, is there anything else going on that you would like to tell the audience about, or where they can find you, or anything like that? Let us hear about it.
Well, thank you for taking the time to ask these questions and inviting me onto your podcast. Thanks also for telling people about the book. We really want to open this conversation up to a wider audience, because there are a lot of difficult ethical and philosophical questions about what kind of world do we want to live in, and do we want to have neurochemical control over our love lives, and what even is love, and how does it relate to neurochemistry? And these are the kinds of questions we talk about in the book, but it needs to be a public conversation, because these technologies are already here. We're using psychedelics in clinical trials right now, looking at PTSD and so forth, but those very same drugs have interpersonal effects. And so this is a call to a public conversation to decide how ethically we want to deal with these substances as we move forward. And then to answer your question about social media accounts and so forth, people can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Brian David Earp, EARP. Most of my papers are available on ResearchGate or academia.edu in case you want to read any of this stuff in more detail. And the book, Love Drugs, is available on Amazon in the US, and in the UK, it's called Love is the Drug, has a slightly different title, and it's published by Manchester University Press, but it's the same content. So you can check it out either of those places, depending on where you are. And over time, we're going to try to get the book into wider markets in different countries and so forth. So yeah, thanks again for your questions.
All right, everybody, there you have it. That was Brian Earp, and yeah, like I said, I cannot praise this book enough. As many of you know, I read a ton, and there's so much in this book. And like Brian, said in the closing right there, like it's to open up this conversation about, how much do we want, like drugs, medications, even psychedelics, like involved in, love and relationships. What are the pros and cons? Like, I love these discussions around, where we're headed, and, the ethical questions about it. I love hearing from all of you and having, these conversations, but it's very interesting. And throughout the book, they bring up a ton of, aside from the research, just interesting questions that we should ask ourselves, because something I've realized is that, a lot of people, like, relationships are a major part of their life, and they can either, they either complete you, or they, really hurt you and mess you up. So many good conversations. So make sure you grab a copy of the book. So everything that we were just talking about, the book, it will be linked down in the description, as well as Brian's Twitter down in the description below. And like I said, he is constantly sharing interesting new studies and research. So if you're into that stuff, like, make sure you're following him. He's always talking about cool, interesting stuff and sharing cool news. I love it. Anyways, that's all we got for this episode. But before I let you go, if you enjoy what I'm doing here, just once again reminding you a few ways you can support the podcast. All right, we're still a brand new baby little podcast. We're trying to get the word out. So a great way to help us out is, by, if you're listening on Apple, subscribe to the podcast. You subscribe, Apple's like, oh man, people are subscribing to this podcast, we want to share it with everybody, right? But another way is to rate it and review it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you to leave the best review ever. You don't have to unless you want to, but I do look at, the reviews and take in feedback and all that kind of stuff. But leaving reviews and subscribing to it on Apple really does help push the podcast out. And I love getting more people involved and aware about these conversations and what we're learning about the world through these books and these amazing authors. Other ways to support the podcast and what I'm doing, there's stuff down in the description below. I've self-published some books. They're over at the rewiredsoul.com. You can become a patron. And there's also an affiliate link down below for BetterHelp online therapy. As I mentioned in this episode, I have struggled with mental health issues most of my life. I am a recovering drug addict and alcoholic, and therapy is a huge, huge part of my life. And I personally use BetterHelp online therapy, which is extremely convenient. You use it, on your phone or computer or whatever, and you could text your therapist for sessions. You could do video chat or calls or whatever it is. And one of the coolest things is, if you don't like your therapist, you don't got to worry about some weird, awkward conversation. You just, boom, click a button, you can switch therapists. It's pretty neat. So if you want to check it out, check it out. But anyways, again, free way to support the channel, or the podcast rather, is to just follow, subscribe, and share it on social media with your friends, anybody who you think might be interested in some of these conversations we have, like the ones we just had today with Brian Earp about love drugs. All right, but anyways, I hope you guys are enjoying 2 episodes a week during the month of June. If you guys really like it, I'll keep doing it, because I have so many episodes already recorded. All right, but anyways, that's all we got for this episode, and I will see you next Wednesday with a brand new author talking about another amazing book. So I'll talk to you then, and until then, have a great rest of your day, weekend, whatever day you're listening to this. I hope it is wonderful.